You're a Roman legionary in 60 AD, and your gladius is slick with British blood. The screaming has mostly stopped now, replaced by wet sounds of steel finding flesh and the groans of the dying. Your centurion's orders echo in your skull. No quarter. Even the women. Bodies pile around your feet. Men, women, children, even livestock speared and thrown onto the growing mounds of corpses. The narrow defile has become a slaughter pen. British families trapped by their own celebration wagons, nowhere to run as Roman steel works with mechanical precision. Your sword arm aches from the killing, but there's more work to be done. 80,000 of them, maybe more. The governor wants them all dead, and Roman soldiers follow orders. A British girl, maybe 12 years old, crawls toward the tree line, her leg twisted at an impossible angle. Your Optio points with his vine stick. You know what he means. No witnesses, no survivors, no mercy. You raise your blade, and for a moment her eyes meet yours. There's no hatred there, just confusion. She doesn't understand why the world has become a place where children die in muddy fields for their parents' defiance. But you understand. This is what happens when barbarians challenge Rome. This is what happens when a woman dares to humiliate an empire. This is justice, Roman style, measured in gallons of blood and it counted in thousands of corpses. The killing will continue until every Briton who followed Boudicca is fertilising British soil, until the very idea of resistance is buried so deep it will never surface again. Good evening, fellow time travellers, and welcome back to Slumber Through Time. Before we charge into this buried world of ancient secrets, if you're ready to discover the massacre of 80,000 Britons that Rome never wanted you to know about, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing we're exploring these forgotten stories together from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to step into the blood-soaked fields of ancient Britain, where 80,000 people died in a single day, and then disappeared from history entirely. Tonight isn't about Celtic heroism or Roman glory. It's about a massacre so brutal that it got buried in the footnotes of history, the forgotten slaughter that most people have never heard about. 80,000 Britons lay dead in a single day, but in its aftermath, Rome faced a problem almost as dangerous as the rebellion itself. How do you explain to the civilized world that your greatest victory required the slaughter of women and children? How do you maintain an empire's moral authority when your methods reveal you're no different from the barbarians you claim to civilize? The answer was simple. You bury the truth. You rewrite the story. You make sure that future generations remember Roman resilience and barbarian atrocity, while forgetting the industrial-scale killing that restored imperial order to Britain. The slaughter followed a rebellion led by a Celtic queen named Boudicca. But the action taken to crush her and her people left, even hardened Roman administrators worried it had gone too far. This isn't the story of Boudicca's heroic resistance, that's been told. This is the story of what happened after her defeat. The fire and sword campaign that turned Roman Britain into a graveyard. The economic ruin that followed the killing. The cultural annihilation designed to ensure that British resistance could never rise again. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor who ordered the massacre, didn't leave Britain in triumph. His fire and sword campaign was so brutal that even Emperor Nero, hardly squeamish about violence, worried it would spark new rebellions. The irony was bitter. Paulinus had been forced to clean up a mess he didn't create. A Roman official called a procurator, essentially the empire's financial enforcer in Britain, had sparked the revolt through pure greed. Decianus Cartus flogged Queen Boudicca, seized Iceni lands, and ignited British fury. When the rebellion exploded, Catus fled to Gaul like a coward, leaving the military governor to crush what his financial brutality had unleashed. Paulinus succeeded militarily, but failed politically. Within months of his greatest military victory, Paulinus was quietly recalled and replaced with a more conciliatory governor. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd succeeded too well. The massacre had restored Roman control, but the methods were so savage that continuing them threatened to destabilize the entire province. Rome's complex web of competing officials and divided authority meant that even victorious generals could fall victim to imperial politics. Governor Paulinus's tactical genius was undeniable. Historians still study his battlefield choice at Watling Street, but his legacy was complicated by the very brutality that made his victory possible. Rome needed the rebellion crushed, but they also needed someone who could rule the survivors without creating new enemies every day. The blood has long since soaked into British soil. The screams have faded into historical silence, but their story is undeniable. What really happened when 80,000 people died in a single day? You're Queen Boudicca of the Iceni, and Roman soldiers are holding you face down in the mud of your own courtyard. The leather whip cracks across your bare back for the 40th time, tearing flesh that will never heal properly. Your daughter's screams echo from the soldier's tent nearby, sounds that will haunt your dreams until the day you die. Decianus Catus, Rome's financial enforcer in Britain, stands over you explaining why this is necessary. Your husband Prasutagus tried to be clever, he says, naming Emperor Nero as co-heir with your daughters. But Rome doesn't share power with barbarian women. The whip falls again, 50 lashes. Your ancestral lands, thousands of acres held by your family for generations, are being divided among Roman settlers like wedding cake. Your relatives loaded into slave carts, your royal household stripped of everything valuable enough to ship back to Rome. This isn't conquest. This is theft with official paperwork. When they finally release you, you can barely stand. Blood soaks through your torn dress, mixing with British soil that your ancestors ruled when Rome was still a collection of mud huts. Your daughters won't look at you, can't look at you, their eyes empty as broken pottery. But in that moment, as you taste blood and dirt, something crystallizes in your mind. Something cold and sharp and infinitely dangerous. Rome has just created its own nightmare, and they don't even know it yet. But Boudicca wasn't the first British leader to discover that Roman civilization came with a price paid in blood and dignity. The man responsible for this brutality, Decianus Cartus, had been destroying British resistance through ruthless financial exploitation for years. And he was just getting started. Decianus Cartus represented everything Romans claimed to despise about their empire, while simultaneously embodying everything that made it function. He was a procurator, essentially Rome's chief financial enforcer in Britain. The procurator system was Rome's bureaucratic masterpiece of organised greed. While the military governor handled armies and battles, the procurator controlled money, taxes, and debt collection. They reported directly to the emperor, not the local governor, creating a deliberate tension that prevented any single official from accumulating too much power. But it also gave procurators like Satus independent military forces and the authority to act without oversight when governors were away on campaign. Prasutagus, Boudicca's husband and king of the Iceni tribe, had tried to navigate Roman occupation through careful diplomacy. When he felt death approaching, he crafted what seemed like a clever solution. Name Emperor Nero as co-heir alongside his daughters. Give Rome half the kingdom voluntarily, keep the other half in the family, avoid the total annexation that had destroyed other Celtic tribes. It was the desperate gambit of a man who understood that Rome always collected its debts, one way or another. But Prasutagus had misunderstood something fundamental about Roman law and Celtic custom. Celtic inheritance customs that recognised women's rights meant nothing to imperial bureaucrats, who saw barbarian laws as quaint suggestions rather than binding obligations. When Prasutagus died in 60 AD, Catus saw opportunity. Prasutagus's will became worthless paper. The co-inheritance became total seizure. Celtic legal traditions became obstacles to be swept aside by Roman efficiency. What made Catus' actions even more calculated was their timing and independence. While Procurator Catus was in Britain, Governor Paulinus was 250 miles away on Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales, destroying Druid strongholds. This left Catus with effective control over Roman policy in southeastern Britain, and he used that authority to deploy his own troops in what sources call calculated political brutality. Adding insult to injury, Catus had confiscated money that Emperor Claudius had previously given to British elites as friendship gifts. He was literally stealing imperial bribes that had been meant to keep the peace, then demanding repayment of loans with ruinous interest rates that no British family could possibly meet. The flogging of Boudicca wasn't random violence. Celtic women held status and authority that Roman culture found threatening. Reducing a queen to bloody meat in her own courtyard sent a message to every Briton who might consider defiance. The rape of her daughters was even more calculated. Violating royal women didn't just destroy individuals. It contaminated the divine connection between rulers and ruled, severing the supernatural bonds that legitimized resistance. Catus had turned Roman law into a weapon of cultural annihilation, destroying not just Celtic wealth, but Celtic identity itself. Every seized farm, every enslaved relative, every violated tradition was another nail in the coffin of Celtic independence. When Camulodunum burned and Roman citizens appealed to Catus for protection, the same man who'd ordered brutality against Celtic royalty fled to Gaul like a coward, abandoning the crisis his greed had created. He was about to learn that some enemies become infinitely more dangerous when you try to destroy them completely. The queen he'd flogged and humiliated was about to transform Celtic fury into Roman nightmare, turning 3 Roman cities into funeral pyres that would burn so bright they'd be visible from Rome itself. But to understand how Rome created monsters like Decianus Cartus, how an empire could produce officials who turned brutality into policy, we need to understand the imperial machine itself. Because Catus wasn't an aberration. He was the system working exactly as designed. And if you happen to be a tribal people standing in the way of Roman efficiency, welcome to hell. Its name was Rome, and it came with official paperwork. You're a young Celtic nobleman, and you're standing in the marble halls of the governor's palace in Camulodunum, forced to watch Rome's administrative machine devour your people with bureaucratic precision. Your own signature is required on documents that will destroy your family. Roman law demands Celtic cooperation in their own annihilation. The governor sits behind his desk like a spider in a web of paperwork, barely glancing up as his scribes read the latest reports. Your sister's name appears on a slave manifest that you're required to witness. Your cousin's farm is being transferred to Roman veterans, and you must sign the deed transfer as the surviving male heir. Your tribal lands are being divided among Roman colonists who've never set foot in Britain, and Celtic law makes you legally responsible for facilitating it. The procurator Decianus Catus slides another document across the marble desk. The numbers are staggering, enough to bankrupt every Celtic family in your territory. When you hesitate, his voice hardens. Your hands shake as you sign your people's death warrant. Every stroke of the pen makes you complicit in their destruction. Rome doesn't just steal, It forces you to help them do it, then makes you grateful for the privilege. A scribe hands him a report about increasing British unrest. Catus barely skims it before filing it away. You watch him sign an order authorising the flogging of British nobles who refuse debt collection, an order that could include your own name tomorrow. The pen scratches across parchment like claws on stone, sealing fates with casual indifference. This was the true genius of Roman conquest. They didn't just defeat enemies, they created a machine that turned oppression into profit, brutality into bureaucracy, and theft into taxation. And at the heart of this machine sat one man with absolute power over everything. Emperor Nero sat at the apex of a pyramid designed to funnel wealth from every corner of the known world directly into imperial coffers. Every province, every city, every tribal territory existed to serve one purpose: making Rome richer and more powerful. But ruling an empire spanning 3 continents required a bureaucratic structure so complex that even emperors couldn't manage it directly. Nero's solution was brilliant and terrifying: create competing power centres that would check each other while serving imperial interests. In provinces like Britain, this meant dividing authority between 2 key officials who reported directly to the emperor, but held completely different responsibilities. The governor commanded armies and administered justice. He was Rome's sword and scales. The procurator controlled money and taxation. He was Rome's ledger and collection agency. Deliberately, these men were never equals. The governor outranked the procurator in social status and overall authority, but the procurator controlled the one thing that made everything else possible: cash flow. Create tension between them, and neither could accumulate enough power to threaten imperial authority. Make them compete for the emperor's favour, and both would push harder to extract maximum value from conquered territories. Governors came from the senatorial class, Rome's ancient nobility who understood honour, tradition, and the long-term stability that kept empires functioning. They served for a few years, then returned to Rome for other positions. Their incentive was reputation and political advancement. Procurators came from the equestrian class, essentially Rome's wealthy business community who understood profit margins, risk assessment, and the short-term gains that filled imperial treasuries. They often stayed in provinces longer, building local networks and expertise. Their incentive was wealth accumulation and imperial favour through results. Put a senator focused on long-term stability in charge of armies, and a businessman focused on short-term profits in charge of taxation. Then make them compete for resources and imperial approval. What could possibly go wrong? Procurators like Decianus Cartus weren't aberrations. They were features, not bugs. The system rewarded officials who delivered immediate results while punishing those who worried about long-term consequences. When Catus confiscated money that Emperor Claudius had given to British elites as friendship gifts, he was following standard procuratorial logic. Imperial gifts were investments that should generate returns, not charity that disappeared into barbarian pockets. But the most insidious aspect of Roman financial warfare came from an unexpected source: Seneca the Younger, Nero's own tutor and the empire's most celebrated Stoic philosopher. While writing eloquent letters about virtue, moderation, and detachment from material wealth, Seneca had quietly loaned 10 million sesterces to British leaders at excellent terms for himself. When he grew doubtful of his investment, he demanded immediate repayment with severity. The irony was breathtaking. Rome's greatest moral philosopher, a man who preached that every new thing excites the mind, but a soul that seeks the truth turns from the new to the eternal, was simultaneously operating as a predatory lender. trapping conquered peoples in debt slavery. Celtic leaders who couldn't repay Seneca's loans faced land seizure and enslavement, all while the philosopher composed meditations on justice and human dignity. It's even likely that King Prasutagus himself received some of these loans. In Camulodunum, priests appointed from the native British population were forced to collect taxes from starving Celtic families to maintain the temple of the deified Emperor Claudius. Britons worked themselves into poverty to build monuments celebrating their own defeat. Some collaborated enthusiastically. King Cogidubnus embraced Roman masters so completely he was granted additional territories as reward, British lands stolen from other tribes to pay for his betrayal. But the most arrogant detail about Roman confidence in their administrative control? Camulodunum, the principal Roman town in Britain, was built without fortifications. They were so certain that bureaucratic oppression had broken British resistance permanently that they didn't bother defending their colonial capital. Veterans who'd conquered Celtic warriors lived behind open gates, convinced that debt slavery was more effective than iron chains. Rome's ledgers were perfectly balanced. Their profit margins were exceptional. Their administrative efficiency was unmatched in human history. None of that would matter when 80,000 furious Britons came pouring out of the forests, carrying weapons and the unshakable conviction that some things are worse than death. You're an Iceni warrior in 47 AD, and Roman steel is cutting through your clan brothers like wheat before the scythe. The disarmament order came 3 days ago. Surrender all weapons to Roman authorities for the security and prosperity of the province. Your chieftains tried to negotiate to explain that Celtic warriors without weapons aren't warriors at all. They're just farmers waiting to be enslaved. The Romans weren't interested in explanations. Now you're dying in a muddy field outside your own village, watching Roman legionaries methodically butcher anyone who dared resist. Your sword, forged by your grandfather, carried by your father, blessed by druids in sacred groves, lies broken beside your outstretched hand. 3 generations of Iceni steel snapped like kindling against Roman efficiency. Your young cousin Prasutagus huddles behind an overturned cart, watching everything. Smart boy, he's learning the lesson Rome once taught. Resistance means death. Collaboration means survival. The choice is that simple. The centurion stands over your dying body, cleaning Celtic blood from his gladius. But as your vision fades, you see something that gives you hope. Prasutagus isn't just watching, he's remembering. The fury in his young eyes promises that this won't be the end. Maybe he'll learn to play Rome's game better than you did. Maybe he'll find a way to protect your people that doesn't end in slaughter. Or maybe he'll just become another Roman puppet, dancing to imperial music while his people forget they were ever free. The 47 AD Iceni revolt was just one small rebellion in Rome's conquest of Britain. But how did the free tribes of this island find themselves fighting for their lives against an empire from across the sea? How did independent Celtic peoples become trapped in Rome's web of conquest and collaboration? The answer reveals the true genius of Roman imperialism. They didn't just conquer. They seduced, corrupted, and gradually enslaved entire civilizations while making their victims grateful for the privilege. Rome's conquest of Britain began almost a century before Claudius landed with his legions. Julius Caesar's invasions in 55 and 54 BC weren't serious conquest attempts. They were calculated political theatre designed to advance his personal career through military spectacle. Caesar learned crucial intelligence during his raids, but he also learned that Britain was far more challenging than he'd anticipated. His first expedition with 2 legions was nearly a disaster. His fleet was nearly wrecked in a storm. ships blown off course by contrary winds. British tribes thronged ashore to oppose him, with painted warriors in chariots, using tactics that terrified Roman soldiers who'd never faced such warfare. The resistance was tougher than he'd anticipated. Britons fought from chariots with devastating effectiveness. Worse, there was no central political authority in Britain Caesar could defeat through his usual decapitation strategy. The island was anarchic chaos and different tribes, constantly at war with each other. His second expedition, twice as large, pushed deeper inland and faced Cassivellaunus, the greatest chief of eastern Britain, who organised a tribal confederacy to resist Roman invasion. But even this larger force couldn't achieve decisive conquest in what Caesar found was the coldest place and wettest place he'd ever visited, populated by people Romans saw as more barbarous than the Germans. When troubles in Gaul called Caesar home, he left Britain nearly empty-handed. But he had achieved exactly what he needed, the claim of being the first Roman to cross the ocean and fight mysterious barbarians, without the ruinous cost of permanent occupation. His expeditions were hailed as spectacular achievements back in Rome, earning him a 20-day public thanksgiving. The real invasion came under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE. Claudius had spent his life being dismissed as weak and below par. His own family treated him with utmost contempt. Now finally emperor, he desperately needed a military triumph to prove his worth. Claudius learned from Caesar's struggles. Instead of 2 legions, he sent 40,000 men, a proper invading army. When the great British king, Cunobelinus, died and civil wars erupted, desperate British chiefs appealed to Claudius for help. This gave him the perfect pretext for conquest. But Claudius's genius wasn't just military, it was political. Rather than fight every tribe simultaneously, Rome offered a choice that seemed generous, but was actually a trap. Submit willingly and become a client kingdom with Roman protection and trading privileges. Resist and face the full weight of imperial military power. Many tribes chose what seemed like the smart option. Client kingdoms allowed them to maintain some sovereignty, keep their traditional leaders, and benefit from Roman trade networks. All they had to do was provide tribute, military support when requested, and accept Roman oversight of major decisions. The Iceni were among the tribes that chose collaboration over resistance. They signed treaties, accepted Roman traders, and began the gradual process of integration into the imperial system. For decades, it seemed like the right choice. Roman roads brought prosperity. Roman markets created wealth. Roman protection ended tribal warfare. The 47th CE Iceni revolt revealed the trap's true nature. When Rome ordered tribal disarmament, the Iceni discovered that their partnership had always been subjugation with better marketing. The revolt was crushed with typical Roman efficiency. The lesson was clear. Client status was conditional on absolute obedience. Step out of line, and Rome would remind you that you were subjects, not allies. In the aftermath, Rome needed a new Iceni leader, someone who understood the consequences of resistance but could still command tribal loyalty. Prasutagus was their choice. Young, pragmatic, and traumatized by witnessing Roman brutality firsthand, he seemed perfect for managing a conquered people who still thought they were free. For 13 years, Prasutagus walked the impossible tightrope between Roman demands and Iceni expectations. He collected tribute while protecting tribal customs. He provided military support while maintaining the fiction of independence. He became wealthy through Roman trade, while preserving enough Celtic identity to keep his people loyal. When Prasutagus died around 60 AD, he tried one final desperate gambit to protect his family and people. His will named Emperor Nero as co-heir alongside his daughters, a Roman legal move designed to satisfy imperial greed while preserving some Iceni inheritance. It was the thinking of a man who still believed the system had rules, that Roman law meant something, that collaboration could provide protection. Prasutagus had learned to play Rome's game better than most, but he never understood that the game was rigged from the beginning. The tragedy wasn't just what happened to Boudicca and her daughters. It was that an entire people had been prepared for conquest while being told they were choosing collaboration. Rome had turned the Iceni into accomplices in their own subjugation, then acted surprised when the victims finally realised they'd been betrayed. But some betrayals run so deep that when the victims finally understand what's been done to them, their fury becomes infinite, and infinitely dangerous. But who were these people that Rome was so determined to conquer and control? What kind of civilization had flourished in Britain for centuries before Roman boots ever touched British shores? What was this world that Romans dismissed as barbaric, and why did destroying it require such brutality? The answer reveals why Celtic resistance was so fierce, and why Roman victory required nothing less than cultural genocide. Pre-Roman Britain wasn't the primitive wasteland that Roman propaganda painted. It was a complex tapestry of independent Celtic tribes who had been developing sophisticated societies for over 7 centuries before Claudius ever dreamed of conquest. The first wave of Celts had arrived around the 8th century BC, bringing iron technology that revolutionised British agriculture and warfare. By the 1st century AD, over 1,000 hill fortresses dotted the landscape. Not the desperate refuges of scattered primitives, but the administrative and defensive centres of organised kingdoms with their own laws, customs and identities. The Catuvellauni had become the most powerful kingdom in southeastern Britain, with their kings minting coins and controlling territories that rivaled Roman provinces. Their ruler Cunobelin was so dominant that Roman writers called him King of the Briton, recognising a level of political sophistication that made their barbarian label ring hollow. The Trinovanti controlled rich agricultural lands around what would become Camulodunum. The Atrebates had established trade networks that connected them to continental Europe. The Brigantes in the north were ruled by Queen Cartimandua, a female sovereign whose very existence challenged Roman assumptions about natural gender hierarchy. And then there were the Iceni, Boudicca's people, described as very distinctive and much less in hawk to Roman culture than other tribes. Their coins featured sinister wolves and mask-like faces with single eyes, symbols of a spiritual worldview that Romans found deeply unsettling. They had successfully resisted Roman cultural pressure for nearly 2 decades, maintaining their independence through careful diplomacy, while preserving traditions that stretched back centuries. But it was the Celtic religion that truly terrified Rome. The Druids weren't just priests, they were the living libraries of Celtic civilization. In a culture that transmitted all knowledge orally, Druids served as judges, historians, philosophers, teachers, and strategic advisors to kings. They preserved tribal law, genealogies, historical precedents, and spiritual wisdom in human memory, making them walking repositories of everything that made Celtic society function. Female Druids held equal authority with their male counterparts, another violation of Roman gender concepts. Celtic society regarded the essence of all life as female, with powerful goddesses like Andraste governing victory, Brigantia ruling entire tribes, and the Morigna appearing on battlefields to determine the fate of warriors. Celtic women enjoyed legal rights that would have seemed revolutionary in Rome. They could own property, choose their marriage partners, initiate divorce, serve as rulers, and participate in warfare alongside men. Celtic culture had produced Queen Cartimandua, who commanded armies and negotiated treaties as an equal with Roman officials. It had created a society where Boudicca could inherit royal authority and lead a confederation of tribes without anyone questioning her gender-based right to rule. The spiritual dimension of Celtic warfare was equally alien to Roman thinking. Celts believed warfare was a deeply spiritual act, where their gods determined the moment of each warrior's death. This made some fighters fearless in battle. If the gods hadn't chosen your death moment, no Roman steel could touch you. Sacred groves served as temples where warriors sought divine guidance before battle, releasing animals to interpret omens, and performing ceremonies that connected military strategy to cosmic forces. The Iceni maintained a massive artificial oak grove, where their royal couple Prasutagus and Boudicca may have presided over rituals that bound their people to landscape and ancestry in ways Romans couldn't comprehend. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated spiritual technologies that had sustained Celtic civilization for centuries. Celtic metalworking rivaled or exceeded Roman craftsmanship. Their warriors carried weapons forged by master smiths, decorated with intricate patterns that told stories about the bearer's lineage and achievements. Celtic jewellery, talks, and artistic objects displayed technical skill and aesthetic sophistication that Roman collectors prized despite dismissing their creators as barbarians. Most importantly, Celtic society was economically successful without Roman assistance. British tribes had developed extensive trade networks, efficient agricultural systems, and sustainable relationships with their environment that supported populations large enough to field armies that terrified Roman legions. But this complex civilization had one fatal weakness: political disunity. Political unity was virtually non-existent, and warfare between the tribes a commonplace phenomenon. The Catuvelauni fought the Trinovantes. The Brigantes split into pro- and anti-Roman factions. Regional conflicts over territory, resources, and prestige had been raging for generations, creating exactly the divisions that Roman strategy exploited. When Caesar arrived, he found British chieftains interested in Roman alliances against their tribal enemies. When Claudius invaded, some chiefs actually appealed for Roman help in their civil wars. Celtic military prowess was never in question. Individual tribes had repeatedly proven they could defeat Roman forces, but they couldn't overcome their own political fragmentation. For Romans who believed their way of life was the only possible expression of human advancement, Celtic civilization represented an existential threat. If barbarians could create sophisticated societies without Roman law, Roman gods, or Roman gender hierarchy, what did that say about Roman superiority? The answer was simple. Such societies couldn't be allowed to exist. They had to be conquered, converted, or eradicated completely. Which is exactly what happened. But the destruction would prove more difficult and more costly than anyone imagined, because Celtic civilization had produced something even more dangerous than effective warriors, people who would rather die free than live as slaves. You're a Roman tax collector in Camulodunum, and the barbarian woman standing over you has eyes like winter storms. Her naked body is painted with spirals that seem to move in the firelight. Blue woad mixed with ash from your burning villa. Blood from your severed hand drips between her toes, but she doesn't flinch. Behind her, the forum where you auctioned Celtic children is collapsing in flames hot enough to crack marble. You try to speak, to offer bribes, to beg for mercy, to explain that you are just following orders, but your tongue won't work anymore. Too much blood in your mouth. Too much terror in your chest. The sounds coming from your throat aren't words. They're the animal noises men make when they realise they're about to die badly. She raises the iron blade above your face, Celtic steel forged in sacred groves you helped destroy, blessed by druids you helped hunt, sharpened on whetstones, wet with tears from mothers whose babies you sold to Mediterranean brothels. The blade comes down, but this isn't just revenge, this is reckoning. Every Roman villa burning around you belonged to veterans who'd enslaved British tribes. Every screaming official being dragged from his house had grown rich on Celtic suffering. Every merchant begging for his life had traded in British flesh. You're dying in the ruins of a city built on stolen land, surrounded by people you thought you'd conquered forever. And this is only the beginning. Boudicca's armies are already marching on Londinium, on Verulamium, carrying fire and iron to every place where Roman greed took root in British soil. The Empire thought it had tamed these people. Tonight, they're learning what happens when the beast finally breaks its chains. Boudicca's rebellion wasn't random violence. It was surgical destruction designed to erase every trace of Roman power from British soil. But how did 60 years of careful imperial planning collapse in just 3 months of coordinated fury? The answer lies in something Rome never understood about the people they'd conquered. That some things are worth dying for, and some betrayals can only be answered with total war. Governor Suetonius Paulinus was 300 miles away on Anglesey, butchering druids in their sacred groves. His finest troops were with him, leaving Camulodunum, Rome's showcase colony, completely defenceless. This retirement paradise for Roman veterans had been built without walls. The old legionaries who'd enslaved Gauls and slaughtered Germans now treated the Trinovantes, the original inhabitants, basically as slaves, appropriating their harvests, their livestock, probably their women. They acted as though they had received a free gift of the entire country, calling proud Celtic warriors captives and slaves in their own ancestral territory. Fatal mistake. Boudicca's intelligence came from Celtic women working as Roman servants, kitchen slaves who heard military dispatches, bedchamber attendants who learned which gates remained unguarded. For 60 years, Romans had treated British women as invisible. The attack came at dawn. Celtic war cries shattered the morning air, while naked warriors, painted with spirals and animal totems, charged like forest spirits, hunting the invaders who'd defiled sacred ground. The Roman veterans broke before the first spear was thrown. Procurator Catus sent just 200 lightly armed men against Boudicca's thousands. They were slaughtered like sheep. The survivors fled back to their unfortified city, carrying news that turned Roman confidence into liquid terror. The killing was surgical. Veterans who'd grown fat on stolen harvests discovered that some debts can only be paid in blood. The Trinovantes finally remembered they outnumbered their oppressors. Celtic women, who'd been appropriated like livestock, showed their captors what wild animals could do when the cage door opened. The massive Temple of Claudius, built with forced British labour and funded through crushing taxation, became the veterans' final refuge. For 2 days, they cowered inside while Boudicca's warriors surrounded the building, their former slaves laughing outside, planning their deaths in the British tongue they'd forbidden their children to speak. When the rebels broke through, the slaughter was biblical. Meanwhile, Petilius Cerialis was racing south with the 9th Legion. They never reached Camulodunum. Boudicca's forces ambushed them on the road, slaughtering the infantry to the last man. The 9th Legion ceased to exist in a single afternoon of British fury. By sunset, Camulodunum was erased. The temple burned with fires so intense that stones cracked and bronze melted. Archaeological evidence shows burn layers still visible 2,000 years later, proof of deliberate methodical obliteration. But Boudicca wasn't finished. Governor Paulinus reached Londinium with barely 2,000 men, took one look at Boudicca's approaching forces, and abandoned the city without a fight. Rome's great military hero fled rather than face the fury of British women whose daughters had been violated by Roman soldiers. The destruction of Londinium and Verulamium followed the same pattern: complete, deliberate erasure. 70,000 Romans died across 3 cities in barely 3 months. An entire generation of colonists, administrators, and collaborators erased from British soil. Standing in those ruins, Boudicca had achieved something unprecedented. She'd proven that empire wasn't invincible, that conquered peoples could break their chains, that sometimes the right kind of violence could burn away every trace of injustice. But Rome never forgave rebellion. The legions were already marching from across the empire, carrying with them the promise of calculated, professional, devastating vengeance. 3 cities lay in ruins. 70,000 Romans dead. The mightiest empire in history humiliated by people they'd dismissed as primitive barbarians. But in Rome, Emperor Nero was learning news that terrified him more than military defeat. The army that had broken Roman Britain wasn't led by a king or a warlord or even a desperate male chieftain. It was led by a woman, your Emperor Nero, and the dispatch trembling in your hands contains words that make your bowels turn to water. Camulodunum destroyed, 9th Legion annihilated, Londinium abandoned. Enemy commander is a woman. Your secretary reads the casualty reports aloud while you stare at the marble floor of your palace, counting the veins in the stone, because looking up means facing the senators who have gathered to witness your humiliation. 70,000 Romans dead. 3 cities erased. Your finest troops fleeing from naked barbarians, led by a female savage whose name the scribes can barely spell. Boudicca, you whisper, and the sound feels like poison on your tongue. Your stomach lurches, not from fear, though terror claws at your chest like a caged animal, but from something worse. Shame. The kind of gut-deep mortification that makes grown men vomit in public. Because every senator in this room is thinking the same thing you're thinking, the same thing every Roman citizen will think when this news spreads through the city like plague. The mighty Roman Empire, conqueror of Gaul, master of Germania, ruler of the Mediterranean, has been brought to its knees by a woman, a barbarian woman. Your hands shake as you set down the dispatch. Around you, marble statues of your divine ancestors seem to turn their faces away in disgust. Augustus, who built this empire. Claudius, who conquered Britain. All watching their descendant reduced to a laughingstock by some painted savage whose daughters couldn't even defend themselves from Roman soldiers. But it gets worse, because the reports describe something that shouldn't exist in the natural order of civilization. Celtic females fighting without armour. Women leading armies. Barbarian queens commanding the loyalty of thousands of warriors who should have been kneeling to Roman authority. Everything you believed about power, about gender, about the divine right of imperial rule, shattered by news from a distant island where the laws of civilization apparently don't apply. The news from Britain didn't just represent military defeat. It triggered an existential crisis that struck at the very foundations of Roman identity. Because the empire wasn't built on superior tactics or better weapons. It was built on the unshakable belief that Roman men were naturally superior to everyone else, especially barbarian women. Now that belief lay in ruins alongside 3 British cities. The dispatch riders had galloped through Gaul without stopping, carrying news so devastating that even hardened centurions wept when they heard it. Word spread through Roman territories like wildfire. The British tribes had risen. Cities were burning, legions were destroyed. But buried in those reports was a detail that made Roman stomachs churn with something deeper than military concern. The enemy was led by a woman. In Roman culture, this wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Roman law denied women legal independence. Roman society confined them to domestic roles. The entire imperial project was justified by the superiority of Roman civilization over barbarian chaos, and that superiority was fundamentally masculine. Roman men conquered. Barbarian women submitted. That was the natural order of the world. Boudicca's rebellion shattered that order like stone against iron. Emperor Nero's initial reaction was physical revulsion. He'd vomited upon hearing the first reports, then spent hours refusing to see advisors. The man who fancied himself a god among mortals couldn't process the idea of defeat by someone his culture considered less than human. But the crisis went deeper. Nero had never been enthusiastic about Britain, considering it a bit of a dump, and questioning whether it was worth the effort to hold. Now, with 70,000 Romans dead and 3 major cities reduced to ash, abandoning Britain seemed rational. According to historian Suetonius Tranquillus, the scale of destruction had almost persuaded Nero to abandon Britain entirely. Only fear of appearing to detract from the glory of his father kept him from ordering immediate withdrawal. Claudius had conquered Britain to prove his worth as emperor. Abandoning it would dishonour the imperial legacy. The psychological impact on Roman forces was devastating. Centurions reported unprecedented problems with military discipline as stories from Britain spread through the barracks. Veterans who'd served in Germania and Gaul described British female warriors as unnatural, demonic, violations of divine order. But some Roman soldiers, in private moments, admitted something more disturbing. Celtic women were ferocious, stronger than Celtic men by far, delivering blows like shots discharged by the twisted cords of a catapult. They could go toe-to-toe with any Roman warrior. Tacitus later wrote that the British rebellion caused Romans to feel the greatest shame, not because they'd lost battles, but because they'd lost to people who shouldn't have been capable of winning. Roman identity was built on assumptions of inherent superiority that Boudicca's victories had proven false. The legions were mobilizing. Professional killers with decades of experience were converging on Britain from across the empire. They carried more than weapons. They carried the desperate need to prove that Roman masculinity hadn't been broken by barbarian women. But Boudicca's forces were also growing. Every British victory brought new tribes to her banner. Every Roman humiliation convinced more Celts that independence could be won through blood and iron. The stage was set for the most decisive battle in British history. At Watling Street, 2 armies would collide to determine whether an empire built on assumptions of masculine superiority could survive being challenged by enemies it had never imagined. The slaughter was about to begin. You're Boudicca, and you've just realised you've led your people into a slaughter pen. The Roman line stretches across the narrow mouth of the valley like a bronze and iron wall. 10,000 legionaries in perfect formation, their shields locked, their short swords gleaming in the pale British sun. Behind them rises a wood that makes flanking impossible. Ahead stretches open ground that will become a carpet of Celtic dead before this day ends. Behind you, 230,000 warriors cover the hillside, an entire people on the march, masses of infantry and cavalry united under your war banner, the largest army ever assembled in British history. But looking at Suetonius Paulinus's chosen ground, you understand with sick clarity that numbers mean nothing here. Your stomach turns to ice as you hear the sounds behind your army. Laughter. Children playing. The creak of wagon wheels as British families settle in to watch their warriors destroy the Roman invaders. Your own people brought their wives and children to witness this expected victory, creating a wall of celebration behind your forces. Now those same wagons form a trap you've built with your own people's confidence. You grip your spear until your knuckles turn white, feeling the weight of every decision that brought you to this moment. The flogging that split your back, your daughter's screams, those sacred princesses violated in an act of sacrilege that offended the gods themselves. The fury that burned so bright it united sworn enemies under one banner, all leading to this. This perfect killing ground where Roman discipline will grind British courage into bloody paste. But your Boudicca, she who brings victory, priestess of Andraste, queen of the Iceni. You invoke the goddess one final time, releasing a trembling hair from your robes. The small creature bounds toward the Roman lines, and you read the omen in its path. The gods have chosen this moment. If death comes, let it find you unashamed. Your war cry rises from your chest, carrying with it the voices of every British mother whose children were sold to Roman brothels. Every Celtic warrior reduced to slavery in his own land. Every sacred grove burned to feed imperial greed. The sound echoes off the valley walls like thunder, and 200,000 voices answer. The earth itself seems to tremble under the weight of British fury. But fury doesn't stop Roman pylons, and courage doesn't break discipline formations. The Battle of Watling Street would determine not just the fate of Roman Britain, but whether an empire built on assumptions of masculine superiority could survive being challenged by enemies it had dismissed as naturally inferior. For Boudicca, this was about freedom or death. For Rome, this was about proving that imperial ideology was stronger than barbarian fury. Governor Suetonius Paulinus had chosen his battleground with the cold calculation of a professional killer. The narrow defile near Watling Street funneled the massive British force into a killing zone where their greatest advantage became their fatal weakness. Behind the Roman line rose dense woods that prevented Celtic flanking manoeuvres. Celtic fury would meet Roman steel in a mathematical equation written in blood. Paulinus commanded roughly 10,000 professional soldiers. Facing them was an entire people on the march. Cassius Dio claims up to 230,000 troops, though modern historians view these numbers sceptically. But even conservative estimates put British forces at over 100,000 warriors, united by shared hatred of Roman oppression and absolute faith in their warrior queen. But Paulinus had noticed something that would doom them all. The Britons had brought their families to watch. Thousands of wagons stretched behind the Celtic army, filled with wives, children, elderly relatives who'd come to witness the final destruction of Roman power. It was testament to British confidence and strategic disaster that would turn celebration into catastrophe. Boudicca rode her war chariot along the Celtic lines, her towering height and terrifying appearance inspiring awe even among Roman observers. Her final speech, preserved by Roman historians, captured the moment. It is not as a woman descended from noble ancestry, but as one of the people that I am avenging lost freedom, my scourged body, the outraged chastity of my daughters. We must win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live and be slaves if they will. The charge began with the traditional Celtic war cry. 200,000 voices answered, creating a sound like the world ending. The Celtic host poured across the open ground like a human avalanche, their headlong charge driven by unnatural fury. For a moment, It seemed the gods favoured justice. The Celtic front lines crashed into Roman shields with such force that the entire formation staggered. Spears found gaps in armour. Celtic steel drank Roman blood. But Romans don't break easily. Their shields locked tighter. The legionaries launched devastating barrages of pilums, then advanced in wedge formation. Their short gladi worked with mechanical precision, stabbing through Celtic mail and flesh. Where Celts fought with passion, Romans fought with cold professionalism honed in 100 campaigns. The narrow defile became a slaughter pen. Celtic warriors could only attack a few dozen at a time, while Romans presented an unbroken wall of bronze and steel. Bodies piled up like cordwood, blocking reinforcements. Many Britons lacked proper armour, their courage no match for Roman iron. The breakthrough came when Roman auxiliary cavalry crashed into the British rear, turning organised resistance into panicked flight. But flight was impossible. The wagons that had brought Celtic families to witness victory now blocked every escape route. Warriors found themselves trapped between Roman steel and vehicles carrying their wives and children. What followed wasn't battle, it was butchery on an enormous scale. Tacitus wrote that legionaries gave no quarter even to the women, unusual for profit-focused Romans who typically enslaved captives. Even baggage animals were speared, adding to the immense pile of bodies. The deliberate killing of women and animals, which could have been sold for profit, underscored the genocidal nature of the Roman response. The casualty figures stagger even by ancient standards. Tacitus claims 80,000 British dead against just 400 Roman losses. Modern historians estimate at least 40,000 Celtic dead. Whatever the exact count, archaeological evidence supports massive Celtic casualties concentrated in a small area. Entire families died together. Warriors who'd survived the initial charge were cut down alongside their fleeing wives and children. The wagons that should have carried celebration became funeral pyres for British independence. Boudicca herself fell in the final stages. Tacitus claims she ended her days by poison to avoid capture. Cassius Dio suggests she fell sick and died, and was given costly burial by surviving Britons. Whether by Roman sword, her own poison, or illness brought on by grief, the priestess of Andraste had won her final battle against Roman humiliation. Her daughters, those sacred princesses whose violation had triggered this massive rebellion, vanish from historical records entirely. Their fate remains one of history's cruelest mysteries. Poenius Posthumus, commander of the Second Legion who'd refused to join the fight, fell on his sword in shame when he learned of the glorious victory he'd missed. Rome had proven that imperial ideology was stronger than barbarian fury, that feminine leadership would ultimately succumb to masculine Roman discipline. The empire's belief in its own invincibility was restored through the simple expedient of killing everyone who dared to challenge it. Standing among the 80,000 British corpses, Suetonius Paulinus had achieved something unprecedented. He'd answered ideological challenge with methodical slaughter, proving that some truths could only be taught through overwhelming violence. The rebellion was over. The real brutality was about to begin. 80,000 Britons lay dead, their blood soaking into soil that would remember this slaughter for generations. But for Rome, military victory was just the beginning. The tribes that had dared to challenge imperial assumptions about gender and power would now learn what happened to civilizations that forgot their place in the natural order. Fire and sword would follow. Not just punishment, but annihilation of everything that had made Celtic resistance possible. You're a druid, and the sacred oak grove, where your ancestors whispered to the gods for 1,000 years, is burning around you. The flames climb the ancient trunks like liquid gold, consuming bark that has witnessed the rise and fall of Celtic kings, the birth of warriors, the blessing of harvests since time beyond memory. Each crackling branch carries away another fragment of your people's soul. The smoke tastes of sorrow and endings. Roman soldiers moved through the grove with methodical precision, their torches kissing every sacred tree, their axes biting into oak hearts that once pulsed with divine wisdom. They're burning the druids in the same fires that had been prepared for Roman invaders, turning your own sacred flames against you. This isn't random destruction. It's calculated revenge designed to cut the spiritual arteries that keep Celtic culture alive. You press yourself against the largest oak, feeling its death tremors through the bark. And remember when this was the great artificial oak glade at Feckenham Way, where King Prasutagus held his priestly status as mediator between the people and the gods, where the royal marriage blessed the land itself with fertility and protection, where the dimension of the supernatural was woven into every political decision. The grove had been deliberately constructed, great serried ranks of posts and fences sticking up deliberately, trying to look like a grove of oaks, a massive symbolic grove where the great massing of the Iceni had gathered to join Boudicca's revolt. Every oak planted with ceremony, every pathway carved according to ancient wisdom. Here, the holy couple had presided over their people's destiny. Now Roman boots trample the sacred earth, where Celtic children once learned that their rulers were more than mere mortals. They were bridges between the human and divine worlds. One day, archaeologists will discover the remains of this sacred place during the construction of an industrial estate, where people will come to buy windscreen replacements, never knowing they walk on ground once blessed by Celtic kings. A centurion spots you crouched against the dying oak and raises his gladius. But you don't run. You're the last keeper of 1,000 years of stories, the final voice that remembers when your people understood that political power and spiritual authority were inseparable. If the grove must die, you'll die with it. The blade comes down, and with your blood, another thread connecting the Celtic past to any possible future is severed forever. Behind you, the sacred flames consume not just wood and bark, but the living memory of a civilization. Rome isn't just conquering territory. They're performing cultural surgery, cutting away everything that makes the Britons who they are. This is how empires truly win. Not through battlefield victory alone, but by ensuring that the defeated forget they were ever anything else. The slaughter at Watling Street was just the beginning of Rome's revenge. Now Celtic identity itself would burn away like smoke from sacred groves. Because Rome had learned a crucial lesson. Defeating armies wasn't enough. To prevent future rebellions, they had to destroy the very idea that British independence was possible. In the aftermath of Watling Street, Governor Suetonius Paulinus unleashed a campaign of destruction that went far beyond military necessity. Roman forces scoured the island, putting everything to the torch, targeting the spiritual and cultural infrastructure that held Celtic society together. The sacred groves received special attention. These weren't just religious sites. They were repositories of Celtic knowledge and oral tradition, where druids served as spiritual leaders, philosophers, legal experts, and strategic advisors to kings. Each grove that burned took with it centuries of accumulated wisdom. Genealogies, laws, seasonal rituals, and songs that carried ancestral voices. Paulinus had learned their value during his campaign on Mona, where Tacitus recorded Roman soldiers standing transfixed, rooted to the ground in fear, when faced with druidesses described as wild-eyed furies, brandishing light torches and screaming terrible high-pitched ululations. The supernatural atmosphere of Celtic war magic had nearly broken Roman discipline. Now Paulinus was ensuring that source of psychological terror would never threaten Rome again. Roman soldiers didn't just burn the trees, they salted the earth to prevent regrowth, smashed stone circles, and defiled sacred pools. They burned the Druids in the same fires that had been prepared for Roman invaders, turning sacred flames into instruments of cultural annihilation. The Iceni's great artificial oak glade at Feckenham Way received particular attention. This massive, deliberately constructed sacred grove, where the great massing of the Iceni had gathered to join Boudicca's revolt, wasn't just royal property. It was the physical manifestation of Celtic beliefs about the sacred dimension of kingship, where political power and spiritual authority were inseparable. The destruction extended beyond religious sites. Roman forces targeted hill forts where tribes had gathered for centuries, craft workshops where traditional weapons were made, trading centres that predated Roman conquest. Each destroyed settlement erased a community's particular way of life. Craftsmen who knew traditional techniques, storytellers who preserved local legends, musicians who played ancient songs. Within a generation, young Britons struggled to communicate with their grandparents. Celtic languages weren't formally banned. They simply became markers of low status and rural backwardness. Speaking British marked you as a savage. Speaking Latin opened doors to imperial opportunities. Standing in the ashes of the great oak glade, Roman commanders had accomplished something unprecedented in imperial history. They'd proven that cultural genocide could be more effective than military occupation, that destroying a people's memory was more permanent than breaking their armies. Your Cornelius Tacitus, and the stylus trembles in your hand as you stare at the military dispatches that will never see daylight. The raw field reports from Britain describe things no Roman citizen can be allowed to read. Celtic women fighting naked, their war paint mixing with Roman blood as they cut down veterans with surgical precision. Soldiers fleeing in terror from barbarian females who moved like water around their formations. An entire legion, the 9th, ceasing to exist because disciplined Roman infantry couldn't function when faced with enemies their culture said were impossible. Your father-in-law, Agricola, was there. He saw it all. In private moments, when wine loosens his tongue, he whispers about things that haunt his sleep. Celtic queens who commanded absolute loyalty. British women who fought with skill that matched or exceeded Roman males. The terrible sound of feminine war cries that turned grown legionaries into whimpering children. But none of this can appear in your histories. You dip your stylus in ink and begin the careful work of transformation. The Britons make no distinction of gender in their leaders. You write, then pause. Too explicit. Too dangerous. You scratch out the line and try again. British resistance was marked by barbaric rage and feminine hysteria. Better. Vague enough that future readers might interpret it as evidence of Celtic degeneracy rather than military effectiveness. Each word is chosen with surgical precision, each detail crafted to serve imperial propaganda needs. You're not just writing history, you're performing surgery on memory itself, cutting away the truths that could destroy Roman assumptions about gender, power, and the natural order of civilization. The real dispatches, the ones describing Roman soldiers breaking at the sight of painted Celtic women wielding iron weapons, will be filed in military archives marked confidential and gradually lost to administrative neglect. The medical records detailing psychological trauma among veterans will be destroyed as detrimental to recruitment efforts. Your stylus moves across parchment, carefully transforming military reality into acceptable fiction. Every barbarian queen becomes a mad woman driven by personal grief. Every female warrior becomes a desperate civilian caught in combat. Every victory by women becomes evidence of male weakness rather than female strength. You're creating the narrative that will survive for 2,000 years, burying the truth so deep that future generations will never suspect it existed. The cover-up began before Boudicca's body was cold. Rome deployed its most sophisticated weapon against the psychological damage of the rebellion, a propaganda machine designed to rewrite reality itself, because the empire had learned that some defeats are too dangerous to acknowledge, some truths too threatening to preserve. The challenge facing Roman historians was unprecedented. How do you explain to imperial citizens that their supposedly invincible legions had been broken by people they had been taught to consider naturally inferior? How do you preserve masculine imperial ideology when barbarian women had proven more effective warriors than Roman men? The solution was damnatio memoriae, the erasure or transformation of official accounts about undesirable individuals or events. Cassius Dio, writing a century and a half after the events, exemplified this revisionist approach. He claimed Boudicca commanded 120,000 troops, an obvious exaggeration designed to magnify the eventual Roman victory. His descriptions of Boudicca's speeches were complete fabrications, crafted for Roman audiences who needed to believe that female leadership was inherently irrational. Most tellingly, Dio's account completely omitted the flogging of Boudicca and the rape of her daughters, instead focusing on a dispute over Roman loans as the cause of the uprising. This wasn't historical oversight. It was deliberate editing to remove the most damaging evidence of Roman brutality against women. Tacitus, though generally considered more reliable due to his father-in-law, Agricola, being an eyewitness, still filtered events through acceptable imperial frameworks. His account preserved some uncomfortable truths. The Britons make no distinction of gender in their leaders, but immediately qualified such statements as evidence of barbarian disorder rather than alternative social organisation. Both historians consistently portrayed Boudicca through misogynistic stereotypes designed to diminish her achievements. She became a woman of towering height and terrifying appearance, with fiercely flashing eyes and a rasping voice. A wild-eyed fury driven by barbaric rage rather than political competence. This demonization served to justify brutal Roman retaliation while making female military leadership seem unnatural and temporary. The inflation of enemy numbers while downplaying Roman losses was standard practice. Roman historians routinely claimed Celtic armies numbered 200,000 to 300,000 warriors, figures that modern historians consider completely unrealistic. Meanwhile, Roman casualties were minimized or blamed on tactical surprise rather than enemy effectiveness. The demolition of the Iceni's great artificial oak glade at Feckenham Way wasn't just military necessity. It was symbolic annihilation. This was a massive sacred grove to the Iceni people, where Boudicca and Prasutagus had ruled as a holy couple. By destroying Druid holy places and executing the memory keepers, Rome was eliminating the primary means by which Celtic history and traditions would be passed down. Unlike Roman written records, Celtic culture lived in the memories of the Druids. When these living libraries died, the past itself was murdered. Standing in his study, stylus poised over parchment, Tacitus understood his role in this massive deception. He wasn't just recording history, he was crafting the version that would survive. Every word had to preserve Roman dignity, while burying evidence that could challenge imperial assumptions about gender and power. You're a young Celtic child in the ruins of what was once your world, and you can't remember your grandmother's songs anymore. She used to sing them every evening as the fire died down, her voice carrying stories older than the stones beneath your feet. Tales of warrior queens who ruled with wisdom and strength. Legends of sacred groves where the gods spoke directly to mortal ears. Histories of a time when your people were free. But your grandmother is dead now, her throat cut by Roman steel during the Great Burning. And with her died the melodies that connected you to 1,000 generations of Celtic ancestors. The Romans have built a new school where you're learning Latin words that taste like ash in your mouth. They tell you stories of their gods, their heroes, their version of civilization. When you try to speak the old tongue, the teacher strikes your knuckles with a wooden rod until they bleed, but you remember fragments, pieces of what was lost. Your grandmother's hands as she wove patterns that told stories, the way the druids read omens in the flight of birds, the sacred pools where your people left offerings for gods whose names you're forgetting. Most of all, you remember her voice when she spoke of Boudicca, not the mad barbarian queen from Roman histories, but the priestess of Andraste, who tried to keep the old world alive, who died so that some memory of what your people had been might survive the fire. You close your eyes and try to sing one of the old songs, but the melody has holes in it now, places where your grandmother's voice used to fill the silence. Each gap represents something irreplaceable that Rome has stolen, not just words or tunes, but the soul of a civilization. Around you, British children struggle with Latin pronunciation while their own heritage dies unspoken. They're learning to worship Roman gods while forgetting the sacred groves where their ancestors found the divine in every oak tree, every babbling stream, every season's turn. This is what conquest really looks like. Not just the changing of rulers or the redrawing of maps, but the slow strangulation of memory itself. The transformation of a living culture into scattered fragments that no one remembers how to fit together. Your grandmother's songs are dying with you, and with them, the last echoes of a world where women could be warriors, where spiritual power flowed through the land itself, where people lived connected to forces larger and older than any empire. The final victory wasn't won on any battlefield. It was achieved through the destruction of memory, the deliberate erasure of alternatives, the patient work of making an entire people forget they had ever been anything other than subjects of Rome. This is the true legacy of Boudicca's rebellion, not just the 80,000 who died at Watling Street, but the civilization that died with them. The numbers tell only part of the story. Between 70 and 80,000 Romans died in the 3 destroyed cities. At least 40,000 Britons, possibly 80,000, fell in the final battle at Watling Street, but these casualties, staggered as they were, represented just the beginning of what was lost. The new procurator, Gaius Julius Classicianus, openly criticised Paulinus's methods as counterproductive. Perhaps due to his Gallic background, making him more sympathetic towards the Britons. Classicianus wrote to Nero, stating that no cessation of fighting need be expected until the supersession of Suetonius. There was growing acknowledgement that Boudicca had been mistreated, and anxiety that Paulinus's reprisals were creating a desert and calling it peace. The revolt had been such a severe crisis that it had almost persuaded Nero to abandon Britain entirely. Disgusted with officials who had started the rebellion and the over-the-top post-revolt response, Nero transferred Paulinus's army to Publius Petronius Turpilianus. The new Roman approach under Turpilianus was markedly different. He and Classicianus worked at healing the wounds and trying to repair the damage. Rome introduced a fairer system of taxation to pacify the Britons, while Classicianus devoted himself to rebuilding Londinium, recognising its importance as the financial centre of Britain. The Romans had decided they were in for the long haul in Britain, given the blood and gold already invested. They sent 2,000 more legionaries from Germany together, with 1,000 auxiliary cavalry and 8 units of auxiliary foot to help stamp out the last flames of resistance. After Topilianus returned to Rome in AD 63, several governors continued this policy shift. Trebellius Maximus was described as indolent, while Vettius Bolanus governed with a milder sway, but proved effective enough to be retained by Emperor Vespasian. Petilius Cerealis, who had commanded the 9th Legion during its near destruction in Boudicca's revolt, returned as an energetic and bold governor who established a new base at York. The cultural transformation accelerated under Julius Frontinus, and later under Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who became governor in AD 77, 16 years after the revolt, where he had served as a young tribune under Paulinus. Agricola actively encouraged British elites to learn Latin, wear togas, and enjoy Roman fine dining. He provided support for building temples, public squares and good houses, fostering urbanisation where cities like London and Bath grew significantly. But even Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law, who celebrated his achievements, offered a darker critique. He saw the adoption of Roman customs as demoralising temptations that corroded the native spirit, viewing it as a form of enslavement to Roman civilization. The famous line, "They create a wilderness and they call it peace," reflected his deep suspicion that Roman culture destroyed the authentic spirit of conquered peoples. After the rebellion's defeat, East Anglia was formally absorbed under direct Roman rule. The Iceni's territory remained for many years underdeveloped due to the vigour of the Roman suppression, a deliberate punishment that lasted for generations. The children growing up in Roman Britain would learn Latin prayers instead of Celtic songs, worship imperial gods instead of local spirits, and accept as natural law hierarchies that their grandparents had successfully challenged. They would never know that alternatives had existed, because all evidence of those alternatives had been deliberately destroyed. This represents the true legacy of Boudicca's rebellion. Not just the immediate casualties, but the civilizational murder that followed. The elimination of memory itself until an entire people forgot they had ever been anything other than Roman subjects.